We're going to continue to hear about the impact of the flooding over the summer on the agriculture community. So we've got folks from NOFA in to tell us, share anything you feel would be helpful for us to know. I know that you also engaged in some in fundraising to support farmers. So we'd like to know about that, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for having us today. For the record, Maddie Kempner, NOFA Vermont Policy Director. I am hoping to share a little bit about, I'll give you a little bit about the Farmer Emergency Fund here at NOFA. And then I'm hoping to share sort of big picture from our perspective, what the response was like for farmers in the wake of the flooding, both at the state and federal level. I know you heard from the folks at the agency earlier this week, so you got a lot of details there, but just wanted to fill in a little bit more about what we heard about the experience from farmers. And then I will turn it over to Bill Kavanaugh, who's our farm business advisor, who can speak in a lot more detail about the Farmer Emergency Fund and how that played out this year on farms, last year on our farms, and the funds that we distributed and the important work that Bill did through that. And then I would like to speak a little bit more following that about some models that we're seeing roll out in other states, and also some recommendations that we have about what could be done here in Vermont going forward. So just to let you know what we're thinking. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, thanks for having me, having us. We have had this Farmer Emergency Fund in place, which is the mechanism that we use to distribute grants following the flooding last July. We've had that fund in place since 1997. And definitely prior to July 2023, the biggest need for funds that we've seen in the history of NOFA through the Farmer Emergency Fund was following Tropical Storm Irene. And if I have my numbers right, and Bill, you can correct me if this is incorrect, but I believe we distributed about $250,000 from the Farmer Emergency Fund following Irene. In July, or since July, in the week of the flooding, we raised over 1.5 million, and Bill can give you a more specific number on that. But I just have to say, from our perspective, the support for the Farmer Emergency Fund from folks all around Vermont and even outside the state was really incredible. And at the same time, the grants that we were able to give to farmers, oftentimes didn't really come close to scratching the surface of the need. That said, these funds were able to be deployed really quickly, which I think is very critical and is something that I will come back to. I also want to express a lot of gratitude to everyone at the state, at the Agency of Agriculture, and our federal partners who worked to get resources to farmers in the wake of the flooding. I know that there were so many people in so many offices around the state who were working really, really hard throughout the remainder of the summer to try to get resources to farms that were impacted by the flooding. And at the same time, those resources, by and large, were woefully insufficient. Many farmers, the vast majority of farmers in the state, as you heard from Abby and Secretary on Wednesday, do not have crop insurance. And a lot of what ended up being available to folks through federal agencies was in the form of low interest loans or some supplemental funding that was provided through existing conservation contracts that NRCS has with farms. And also, as you heard a lot of people speaking to over the summer, loans, low interest or otherwise, really, I think, was not what farmers needed in that time. Some of our farmers experiences losses in the hundreds of thousands, and a farm in that position having just lost their source of income for the remainder of the growing season, really were, for the most part, not in a position to want to take on additional debt, which I'm sure you can understand. The other factor here in terms of the specific impact on farms and the resources available or lack thereof is that farmers were overall, excluded from the resources offered by FEMA. So there was sort of this lots of great and very clear communication from the state and from federal partners telling folks to report their losses to 211, to report their losses to FEMA. with the exception of farm businesses, which were, directed to reach out to FSA, and to other federal agencies. The difference there is in the wake of a disaster, there is really, an influx of staffing provided through FEMA that just does not exist at FSA, at NRCS, at the Risk Management Agency. And so those agencies were really, I think, fairly hamstrung in their ability to respond to farmers' needs, just purely from a capacity perspective, as well as from a resource availability perspective. So I think that was felt by a lot of our farmers who were directed to reach out to FSA, did as they were told to report their losses, and ended up, I think, often feeling like, what was the point? And they weren't really clear if there was anything that was going to be able to come back out of that, to support them, and not by the fault of the people who work at FSA, who I'm sure were doing all they could, but there was just really limited resources and staffing available. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have, obviously, throughout, I want to emphasize that in addition to the losses that you have heard about from the agency, and I'm sure from your constituents, crops, equipment, feed, infrastructure, payroll, and the ability to keep workers on to help with recovery, was a really, really critical need that many farmers spoke about. And I'm sure Bill heard from a lot of farmers about that in his processing of farmer emergency fund applications. And so in thinking about how we can be better prepared to support farmers the next time this happens, which frankly feels somewhat inevitable, I think specifically keeping an eye on the need to support workers on farms is really important, and something that I think often gets has a risk of being overlooked. So I just want to emphasize that, and then I will turn it to you, Bill.
Thanks, Maddie. It was a very good overview. So hi, everybody. I'm Bill Kavanaugh, Farm Business Advisor at NOFA Vermont. My day job is I do farm business advising, usually through the Farm Viability Program, some other stuff at NOFA. And one sort of small part, typically a small part of my job, is administering the Farmer Emergency Fund. Like Maddie said, it's a fund that we've had in place since '97. Typically speaking, we would see maybe one application a quarter or so. I would say that my busiest year before this was maybe had 6 in a calendar year. So it wasn't a huge emphasis of what I was working on before July of this year. So, yeah, we had a really bad flood event, July 10th, 11th. I think our first internal meeting about it was the 12th. I forget days of the week, but I think it was like Wednesday. And we had our first emergency fund application that Friday. So it was really clear to us that we had a lot of pressing need. And I think because of the fact that we had this fund already established, we were really looked at as sort of a first point of contact for farmers, to sort of get some help with cash flow, and also as sort of a clearinghouse of information. So I spent a lot of July and I'd say most of August on the phone. I would sit at my desk in the morning and my phone would start ringing, and I would get up at the end of the day and have just been on the phone all day, which was, it felt really good, but also just sort of demonstrated really the extreme need folks were seeing. To give you a little bit of an overview of sort of the eligibility and sort of how we had this all structured, typically speaking, before this summer, our emergency fund was composed of a $2,500 grant with the option of a $2,500 additional zero interest loan. So $5,000 total, $2,500 was free and clear, $2,500 was repayable at zero interest. Eligibility early on was you had to be a NOFA Vermont member or a NOFA Vermont, VOF certified organic farm. And both of those came with like a 1-year waiting period. So it wasn't like you could just join and instantly be eligible. We sort of, again, in that very early day, that first meeting, we decided that wasn't going to be useful in terms of getting money out to folks who needed it. So we did away with the 1-year waiting requirement. So you could join NOFA Vermont for as little as $1. You're a member. You could apply immediately for emergency funding. We also realized, as Maddie said, that a zero interest loan wasn't in anyone's best interest and wasn't the best way to sort of get money to folks who needed it. So we just changed it to a $5,000 grant. So everybody who was able to apply for up to $5,000 in the first round. So echoing Maddie again, tons of just huge outpouring of support. The donations, I remember sitting in a meeting watching donation emails come in on someone else's computer. It was just crazy the speed at which they came in. At my most recent update from the finance team, it was just around 1.7 million in total funds raised for the emergency fund. It's kind of a tricky number to keep track of because the donations keep coming in. It's slowed certainly, but it hasn't stopped by any means. So yeah, 1.7 million over 3,000 unique donors, which was also really cool to see. A lot of first-time donors, a lot of individuals giving, just what they could to support Vermont's farmers. So that felt really great to be able to sort of take that support they gave and get that to farmers as quick as we could. In the first round of grants, we had 215 total awards given. So 215 unique farms applied and were granted just about $1.1 million. So we kind of realized as this year ended, we still had a lot of money in our emergency fund. There was still a little bit of money coming in, and the need was still there. $5,000 isn't a lot for these farms that have 100,000 plus in losses. So we really it didn't feel great or feel necessary to hold on to a lot of this money. We did want to keep a little bit in the emergency fund. We've always kept, a sum in there for additional, disasters and things as they come in, but we figured the thing to do was get money out. So in December, we put out calls for a second round. So anybody who was awarded in the first round could come back to us, give us a little bit of additional information just in terms of what their total loss was and what their other emergency funding sources were, VCF, state BGAP funding and stuff like that. And then we awarded that back out based on that number, that sort of like total outstanding loss. So I think we actually just sort of finished processing that. We haven't even sent out award emails yet, but we had 123 applicants for that, and all of them got funded on some level. So I don't want to share exact numbers, but basically we had, I think, another $600,000 to parse out, and we more or less sort of divided it amongst folks based on that. So, again, I would say some of these farms probably a total of maybe $10,000 from us, but usually those are ones who we saw had $100,000 plus in losses. So certainly not making people whole, but definitely felt like a really good sort of way to support maybe some cash flow. And Maddie mentioned workers, and I think that was something that we heard from a lot from farmers early days, was just sort of like, I've got to make payroll. I want to make sure my workers are getting paid. I need money like right now. So that seems like that was a really good use of those funds in early days for folks, was to get workers paid. So yeah, I mean, that's I guess sort of an overview. One of the things that I was really proud of in terms of how this was all ran, all of these had to run through a review committee. This whole thing is sort of structured in our bylaws, so we had to work this in a certain way. But we were able to sort of do this in a really streamlined sort of Google Docs based fashion, where we could get all the reviewers to sort of do it asynchronously. So they could log on, get on, see what applications had come in the last day or two, approve them, and then I could move them forward. So we were averaging about 8 days from when the application initially came in to when the check went out. So that felt really awesome as a way to sort of turn that around really quickly for folks. So yeah, that's what I got. Happy to share any additional info, answer any questions. I like Maddie said, I spent a lot of time talking to farmers this year, so I can share stories or anything that folks sort of were coming up against this summer.
Very helpful, Bill. Can you mention again the total between the two rounds that you, roughly anyway, that you were able to disperse?
Yeah, so total raised was 1.7 million. We have so far to date given out 1.1 million. So we've got in the $600,000 range that's going to be going out hopefully as early as next week, as sort of the second round and end of the funding round.
Gotcha. Okay. Representative O'Brien.
Bill and Maddie, how was the fund originally funded? Was it, was it just a line item in your budget, or did members check off or something? I just wondered sort of how much you carried in an escrow rainy day fund before that swell of donations came in.
Do you want to speak to that, Bill?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I could say how it was initially funded. I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that we usually carry around somewhere between maybe 75 and 100,000 in that account. You know, and again, thinking through in a given year, we might see maybe $20,000 in total, you know, total fund access.
You mentioned, Bill, that you didn't want to have barriers, and so you waived the 1 year requirement, and then either lowered the membership fee or allowed people for $1 to qualify. Did you end up enrolling a number of new farmers in NOFA, or was it mostly existing members?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question, and I would actually love to know how many new signups we got for this reason. I would say, just super anecdotally, I bet it was probably about 50-50 sort of existing NOFA Vermont members or VOF certified, and then sort of like new to the NOFA world folks. And, you know, we ended up funding farms who I think most folks wouldn't think would typically be in the NOFA orbit, you know, like some of the larger farms and folks who maybe aren't super on maybe, you know, the organic scale of things. But, you know, again, our sort of philosophy internally was, you know, these funds were given to us as a way to help Vermont farmers. I don't think there was this like huge, like dogmatic, like this must only be for certain types of farms. It was this outpouring of support for Vermont's farms. And our feeling was, let's get the money to farmers regardless of production type or any of that.
So you weren't screening, in other words, for an organic element that was any farmer essentially who could demonstrate the need.
Yep.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Chair Durfee, when you said how many folks enrolled in NOFA, I think you probably know this, but I want to make clear the distinction between organic certification, which is sort of one track for how people are involved with NOFA, and Vermont Organic Farmers, our certification program. And then there's just a NOFA membership program to sort of the nonprofit education and advocacy side. So we were not asking anyone to become certified organic in order to apply for the fund, but just to become a member of NOFA so that we could, you know, really use this as an opportunity to grow our ability to raise funds for this and to advocate for policy change that will keep farmers better protected in the future.
Got it. Thank you. Representative O'Brien.
What were the requirements on the farming side to be eligible? I mean, were they agency requirements or yours, or, you know, were cannabis farms included? I just wondered how you separated out. This is a farm by NOFA standards.
Yeah. So in Maddie a little bit touched on that. I mean, I think, you know, you can be a member of NOFA as a farm organization without having to be certified organic. We do require, as sort of part of our sort of application packet, we do need to see some sort of previous year's financials. So either filed taxes or, you know, a profit and loss from QuickBooks or something, just to sort of verify that they are a farm. We did have a couple applicants who are more sort of home setter types that weren't eligible.
I would just say add one other thing, and Bill can fill in on this as well, but we definitely made an effort following, I think, the initial round of grants. We made an effort to reach out to the farming community to let them know that they did not have to experience catastrophic loss to apply. Because also, as the agency folks touched on Wednesday, it was not just the initial catastrophic flooding event that was impacting folks this season. It was really the ongoing extreme and just like nonstop precipitation. So we did invite, and I believe Bill award grants to folks who just experienced crop losses, which there was a significant number of farmers who experienced crop loss just due to that ongoing precipitation beyond the catastrophic flooding.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just want to echo, like that was a huge thing. A lot of times, like I even think about it as like, oh, we had this flood and we did this flood response, but really it was just a disaster of a summer for Vermont agriculture. And dairy farmers who needed to get hay crop off that just couldn't. That had nothing to do with flooding. They were just, it was so rained out and fields were so bogged down, that was still a major loss to them, even though they weren't directly impacted by floodwaters.
Representative Rice?
Yeah, thanks, Maddie and Bill. Two numbers that I would be interested in having, and you may not have off the top of your head, and that's fine, but one is just what's the sort of general breakdown between folks you were funding because of the July 10th, 11th flooding versus folks you were funding because of that sort of like season long crop loss due to the weather. And then the second is sort of like what's the average loss that you were seeing? So you mentioned farms that were losing, that seen $100,000 worth of loss. I'm just interested in sort of like you've now dealt with 200 plus farms that saw some kind of loss. What does that look like on an average?
Yeah, so I put together a presentation earlier in the fall. So these numbers aren't super up to date, and they're also, I wouldn't call these like scientifically accurate numbers, but sort of the self-reported loss numbers on average that we were seeing was about $30,000 per farm that applied to us. So, self-selecting group, but about $30,000 total. And the sort of breakdown between sort of like acute flood and sort of overall weather is, I think that's a really hard distinction to make, because the farmers who were flooded were still impacted by heavy rains throughout the summer. That was sort of a 1-2 punch. They lost their crops and then they couldn't get new crops in the ground because it just kept raining. So in terms of farmers who had like actual like flood water impacted field crops, I would say maybe very anecdotally, maybe 25% of the applicants that we got. But again, hard to really quantify, because it is, depending on when the application came in and sort of how it was framed, that could be higher or lower.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's just, I think it's important for us to understand sort of moving forward, if weather patterns like this become the norm, even if there isn't sort of like federally declared disaster event, what is the need going to be for farmers that are just experiencing season long crop loss because of, changes in weather patterns? And according to what you just said, it sounds like it's going to be, it could be something close to 75% of what the need was this year.
I would also say like oh, sorry, Bill, did you want to chime in there?
Oh, I was just agreeing.
I just want to say that's not new as of 2023, right? We've seen over the past 5 years and probably longer, flash droughts, for example, that affect, a very particular section of a county. And oftentimes, at least our federal programs are set up so that you have to have a county-wide disaster declaration for those emergency relief programs to kick in, which in Vermont's mountainous topography really is not often how weather patterns affect our farmers. So we really need, and I think that's a place where the state can really supplement some of the programs that the federal government has, programs that are able to respond to weather patterns in a much more granular area beyond or particularly a statewide disaster.
Following up on Mike's question, did anybody in retrospect, look at that hard freeze in May and say, well, I lost my whole orchard, crop this year, or my whole vineyard crop this year? I mean, it's just what we're talking about here, like different type of weather, but equally catastrophic depending on your farm.
Yeah, we did have some applications for that. It was there was at some point, Grace Odell, our executive director, put out a posting on the Veg and Berry listserv, and she sort of called out, hey, we really want to make sure that if we've had disasters related to the weather, we have the funds, we want you to apply. And she called out specifically that frost disaster we had, and we had some applications to that. A lot of vineyards and berry growers did apply sort of once prompted. Yeah, because that was also a big issue. Yeah. Not a good year.
Not seeing any other hands, but Maddie, or actually I do see a hand now, Maddie. I'll let Representative Graham.
So, talking about that May frost, my farm's a little bit higher elevation than and some of them, it actually it killed the grass. The grass stopped growing. And we ended up harvesting, get it off so we could get grass growing again. I mean, what I should have had 200 plus bales, I got 35. And the whole farm. But I knew that if I didn't do that, I would really be in trouble. Then the flood came. I'm still sitting in the field. Thank everybody.
Go ahead, Maddie.
Well, I wanted to share a few more things I thought the committee would be interested to know. And you may be aware of this already, but there is a bill that has either been introduced or is about to be introduced by representatives from Barre and Montpelier, calling for, a lot of different provisions, including recovery funds for impacted communities, and a lot of specific emergency preparedness provisions. But one of the things that's included in that bill is a call to update our hydrological models to allow communities and farmers to plan more appropriately for future flooding events. I think we heard from folks at the Intervale, and I heard from other farmers that I've spoken with that the flooding that they experienced in July was exponentially worse than any models were predicting. And really, in some cases, there are not structures in place right now that folks can look to allow them to know what is coming in terms of flooding events. So updating those models so that we can be more prepared, I think, is a really critical thing that we can do that, ideally doesn't have to cost the state a lot of money and potentially save the state a lot of money in the future and save communities and farms a lot of loss if they can plan appropriately. And then I just wanted to share a couple of other funds that have been either established or are being proposed around our region. In Massachusetts, you may have heard this, the state allocated $20 million in their supplemental budget back in July for farm disaster relief, based on to respond to the February freeze and the May freeze and the July flooding. And those awards were finalized and sent December 5th. There is also proposed legislation in Massachusetts to establish a state disaster relief fund that would be administered by their emergency management agency. And the language says basically it would provide disaster relief and alleviate the damage, loss, hardship, or suffering caused by a natural or human-caused disaster or other catastrophic event, including when a federal or state disaster declaration has not been made, as we were just talking about, or to supplement funding related to a federal or state disaster declaration. So just an example of some proposed legislation that is underway in Massachusetts. In Connecticut, their Department of Agriculture recently announced the opening of a grant called the 2024 Farmland Restoration, Climate Resiliency, and Disaster Preparedness Grant, which is for producers and nonprofits to provide funding for investments which will increase long-term climate resiliency of farming operations and decrease vulnerability to extreme weather. So I think it's really critical in light of this disaster and just ongoing extreme weather that we as a state are planning for both, emergency relief funds that can be rapidly deployed next time an event like this happens, and also really making sure that we are investing in farms' ability to be more resilient to those events. One thing that we haven't spoken to, and I think didn't really plan to talk about, Bill, is our resilience grants program that we've also been running at NOFA for a couple of years now. And I don't know, Bill, if you want to share a little bit about that on sort of the resilience planning side, or if you want me to just say a little bit more.
I've been out of that loop for a couple of years now, so that you might be a little bit better placed to speak to it than I am.
I can share some basic information. I'm happy to follow up too, but essentially we've been providing resilience grants to farmers for the past few years now that have allowed people to invest in, practices or infrastructure on their farms that they deem. And it's also a grant process that is overseen by farmers and farm workers themselves. And we give grants to farmers to help them invest in things that they feel will make them more resilient. And some of those are climate resilience investments. There was a farmer in Athens who put in some swales and really changed the flow of water across their landscape using a resilience grant that they received, I think, a year or two ago. And they really actually saw an impact of that implementing that practice on their farm in the wake of the flooding and then with all of the increased precipitation in July. So I think if there is a way for us to do some investment as a state in both, resilience planning and practice implementation, and also have a fund that is available when that planning isn't enough or has not yet been implemented, I think that's really critical. I also just have to say, a lot of farmers have told us, and I think we can also infer that they may not withstand another event like this. Farms that lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment and weren't really able to recoup, a significant portion of that, just may not stay in business next time this happens. And I also think it's important for us to remember as a state that communities are not always going to be able to step up or be willing to step up necessarily in the way that they did in July. Grace, our executive director, who's out of town right now, otherwise she probably would have joined us. She has shared the example that they had to leave their farm and their home in Northern California because of wildfires. And there in California, where wildfires have become so common, that community response, really wanes after a while because there is fatigue and people can only give so much. So I think it's really important for us to not lose sight of the fact that there was such an incredible groundswell. And I think Vermonters by and large care so deeply about the success and the survival of our farm community. And they may not be able to dig as deep next time this happens. And they themselves may be not in a position because they've been impacted by these weather events to be able to give as much. But I do think, on the positive side, I really feel like the state can make policy choices to be better prepared, both in terms of modeling and in terms of funds that can be quickly deployed. And I just want to say too, that I think partners, community organizations like NOFA, Intervale, the Center for an Agricultural Economy, there's so many amazing, ag support organizations around the state that can and need to be partners in that effort to make sure that we can get those funds out quickly to our communities. So I think it is possible to come up with solutions to this that will set us up better next time.
Yeah, I think maybe you would have said, Maddie, just now, if there, were any farms that did decide to cease operations this year as a result of the weather.
Do you know the answer to that, Bill?
Yeah, so I don't personally know of any, which is a really good thing. I do think one of the things that's been interesting as it's now January is we're still really seeing the effects of what happened this summer. And I'm still talking with farmers pretty much daily who are just now really starting to see some cash flow effects. Dairy farmers, especially, with such a poor crop season, suddenly they're like, not only did I have to buy in a ton of feed and it was super expensive, it also turns out the feed quality is really bad. And now my milk production's down. So, fingers crossed, and hopefully with the amount of support that's been there and in the way this sort of disaster unfolded, hopefully, no one goes out as a result. But I think, people are hurting.
Any other questions? Maddie or Bill, any other thoughts that you wanted to share today?
Not necessarily in detail, but I would just say, think of us, and we are happy to share anything else we can from our experience with this emergency fund and what we're learning from other states. And we would be really, really happy to work with the committee on anything that you want to do to stand up something like what's happening in Massachusetts or elsewhere. And I think also I would just recommend inviting other farm organizations in. There were lots of efforts being made by the other partners that I mentioned last summer that I think can be instructive for the legislature in putting together whatever you might propose in terms of emergency relief. So, just recommend you connect you with folks at the Intervale or other organizations as needed.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Maddie said. I think, we really stress tested our system this summer. And I think, we're happy to share any sort of, more detailed learning or anything if that is at all useful.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Yep. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.